Are those transactions that you're doing personally, or are these through a stockbroker, or are these transactions that you're handling yourself?
So how they happen is I submit proposals under DOJ guidance to say, hey, I would like to trade this or that, and they run their review, and the FBI runs a review, and then they come back and say yes or no, and then I make the transaction.
Can you provide us some clarity on what were the impediments to finding, the account user, and maybe describe in greater detail the FBI's work in that regard?
Generally speaking, yes, because I know even though the shooter's deceased, the investigation we're not done.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. Thank you, Director Patel, for being here today. I have a couple of questions regarding a terrible shooting that occurred in Colorado, a state, as you may know, that I represent. You've testified previously about, I think, what you would describe as your efforts to provide more information regarding the investigation with respect to the horrific assassination of Mr. Kirk. And so, in that same vein, I'm hoping you can provide this committee and my constituents in Colorado with some clarity.
Absolutely.
I think, as my colleagues know, in Evergreen, Colorado, Jefferson County, a county that I proudly represent, at Evergreen High School, a shooter ultimately injured. 2 students were praying for their swift recovery. There's an article here from Colorado Public Radio. The title is, quote, FBI was already investigating an account that may have been linked to the Evergreen shooter. You're familiar with the circumstances generally, Director, regarding this terrible tragedy.
Yes.
So my understanding from the public reporting is that an organization reported to the FBI in July of this year regarding, just reading here from the article, that the FBI opened an assessment into a social media account user whose identity was unknown and who was discussing the planning of a mass shooting with threats nonspecific in nature. This is the FBI's statement to the press. And that the FBI continued to work this assessment investigation to identify the name and location of the user up until September 10th, 2025, which was the day of the tragedy. Can you provide us some clarity on what were the impediments to finding, the account user, and maybe describe in greater detail the FBI's work in that regard?
Generally speaking, yes, because I know even though the shooter's deceased, the investigation we're not done.
Sure.
And so the impediments to finding these individuals, and you highlight a great point. We had 2 huge tragedies in the span of days in this country. The school shooting in Evergreen, Colorado being one of them. And proactively going out onto these social media platforms, which are so large, is our biggest impediment. And we need to rely on the service providers. There's actual legislation, I can't remember the name of it, that's up for renewal, which will, and I think at the end of the month, which gives service providers the ability to report that information in from their end without liability. We need that to continue, because while the FBI has so many people and the police are great at doing it, there's just too many platforms to cover down on.
Well, I appreciate that, Director Patel, and I think we're certainly, I'm interested in continuing this conversation, because I think the reporting suggests that there's a pattern, and that ultimately, we want to make sure that law enforcement is able to prevent this kind of tragedy from happening in the future. I have a question. It's not meant as a gotcha question, so it just frame it there. But it is in regards to some reporting around a periodic transaction report that you had filed earlier, this year. So this is in July, pursuant to the ethical obligations as a senior executive official. You remember filing that in July?
Yes.
Yeah. So in that report, as best as I can surmise, you disclosed that you divested, $100,000 or more in a variety of different stocks,
right,
which I presume was pursuant to the ethics agreement that you negotiated with the Department of Justice. In that same report, there's a disclosure regarding purchases of 2 different transactions. So between $15,000 to $50,000 in a national coffee house chain, and between $50,000 to $100,000 in a semiconductor company on May 9th and May 12th. Are those transactions that you're doing personally, or are these through a stockbroker, or are these transactions that you're handling yourself?
So how they happen is I submit proposals under DOJ guidance to say, hey, I would like to trade this or that, and they run their review, and the FBI runs a review, and then they come back and say yes or no, and then I make the transaction.
Is there a reason that you decided to make the purchases into those 2 companies?
Generally speaking, before I got this job, I was, trading stocks, but not a lot like most people, and I just follow certain industries, and I thought they would be a good investment.
So the reason why I ask, right, because you had divested in other companies.
Yeah.
And I presume that wasn't because there were actual conflicts. It's just that you wanted to avoid an appearance of impropriety.
It was both.
Both. But not all of the companies were conflicts.
Whatever they
you
make
divested
the
from.
I don't make the call, they make the call.
Sure.
Yeah.
I guess my point would be, the reason why I ask is, why I said it's not a gotcha question, I have for years led an effort here in Congress to try to ban members of Congress, senior executive officials, from trading stocks. And it's bipartisan in nature. We're working really hard to get that done, Republicans and Democrats. And you can understand, I think, given your role, given the nature of the position that you hold as the leader of the largest law enforcement agency in our country, that divesting entirely, not doing day trading now, I think would be something that would be in the interest of the American people. So I just would hope you would consider that, and that moving forward, that perhaps not purchasing stocks in individual companies, I would think would be something that would be worth pursuing.
Gentleman's time is...
I'm happy to give the witness an opportunity to answer.
Thank you. I'll work with you.
What we just watched wasn't petty politics. It was a constitutional alarm bell. When Senator Alyssa Slotkin presses Secretary Hegseth about whether he has ordered uniformed U.S. military personnel to detain, arrest, or even use lethal force against protesters, she's not grandstanding. She's doing the one thing our democracy depends on, asking whether the people who hold the guns are acting inside the law and inside our values. Slotkin's line of questioning cuts to the core of several bedrock truths. First, the U.S. military is meant to be apolitical and subordinated to civilian authority consistent with the Constitution. Second, domestic law enforcement and military roles are legally distinct for a reason. That boundary exists to protect civil liberties, free speech, and the right to dissent. Third, when you start blurring those lines, especially during political crises, you risk normalizing the use of force against Americans whose only crime may be protesting. Listen to what Slotkin is asking for, a clear yes or no about authority. That matters because vague answers from the top create space for abuse. Saying troops are there to protect law enforcement is not the same thing as clearly defining their legal authority. Saying troops could temporarily detain in self-defense and hand over to ICE raises major legal and ethical questions. Why would the military be involved in immigration enforcement at all? Posse comitatus and the Insurrection Act exist precisely to limit when and how federal forces can be used on U.S. soil. Those rules require transparency and strict limits. They are not optional. Patel's evasive answers and attempts to pivot to statistics or past administrations don't settle the question. Experience shows that rhetoric about protecting the homeland can become a rubber stamp for overreach if leaders don't insist on guardrails. The reference in this exchange to what Secretary Esper allegedly refused, being asked to shoot at their legs, highlights the practical and moral stakes. Decisions about force are life and death, and a secretary who claims the military can be used as a blunt instrument against civilians is describing a path that corrodes democracy. Slotkin's bigger point was about precedent. Deploying active duty troops without a governor's consent, using them in crowd control roles, or inserting them into policing-like activities are departures from recent practice and from the spirit of civilian control. Even if isolated and framed as temporary or for protection, those deployments reshape expectations. Civilians can begin to fear their own military. Commanders can be pressured to choose politics over principle, and the very idea of protest, the oxygen of a free society, becomes riskier. From a democratic repair perspective, two things follow. One, we need unambiguous public answers from the Defense Department about standing orders, rules of engagement, and whether any active authorization exists to detain, arrest, use cyber tools against, or use lethal force on U.S. persons in the protest context. If such orders exist, they must be produced, justified, and debated publicly. Two, Congress must tighten oversight and, where necessary, legislate clearer limits so that future secret or ambiguous orders can't quietly normalize domestic militarization. For viewers, this isn't abstract. It's a simple civic test. Do we want a system where protesters can be met by soldiers operating under opaque orders? Or do we want a system in which law enforcement is accountable, courts function, governors' authorities are respected, and the military stands apart from partisan policing? If you think the latter is essential, make your voice heard. Call your senators and representatives, demand hearings, and support reforms that restore clear constitutional boundaries. If this matters to you, share this video, subscribe, and keep pushing for oversight. Democracy relies on citizens who refuse to accept ambiguity when lives, liberties, and the Constitution are at stake. If you're watching this and you believe, as Neguse does, that public service should never be about personal profit, then make your voice heard. Demand higher ethical standards from your leaders. Push for legislation that bans stock trading for government officials. Because democracy only works when the people in power serve the people and no one else. So while this hearing may have seemed like a clash over investments, it was really a confrontation over something much larger: what it means to lead honorably in America. Joe Neguse's questioning wasn't about embarrassment or partisanship. It was about defending the principle that public office is not a privilege to profit from, but a trust to uphold.